The December wind carried snowflakes through the downtown streets, each one catching the glow of holiday lights strung along the storefronts. Daniel Morrison walked with his 3 daughters pressed close against him, their mittened hands tucked into his coat pockets for warmth. The girls were bundled in winter coats, Lucy in burgundy, Emma in pink, and little Sophie in cream, their blonde hair escaping from beneath their knit hats. Daniel was 42 years old, with dark hair that showed just a touch of gray at the temples and the kind of steady presence that came from carrying responsibility alone. He'd been a single father for 3 years now, since his wife Rachel had passed suddenly from an aneurysm. Some days still felt impossible, but he'd learned to take life one moment at a time, finding joy in his daughter's laughter and strength in their need for him. Lucy was 9, thoughtful and protective of her younger sisters. Emma was 7, with endless energy and curiosity. Sophie, at 5, was still learning to navigate the world with the innocent wonder that made even grocery shopping an adventure. Together, they'd built a life from the pieces left behind. Not perfect, but filled with love. They'd come downtown to look at the holiday window displays, a tradition Rachel had started when Lucy was just a baby. Daniel had kept it going, understanding that some rituals were too important to let fade. The girls pressed their faces against the glass of each decorated window, pointing out details and telling each other stories about the scenes displayed inside. "Daddy, look at that one!" Sophie called, tugging his hand toward the bookstore window, where a miniature Victorian village was lit up with tiny lights. As they moved along the sidewalk, Daniel noticed other families doing the same thing, parents with children, grandparents with grandchildren, all bundled against the cold, all seeking the magic that seemed more present this time of year. The street was busy but not crowded, filled with the kind of gentle activity that made a city feel like a community. They were approaching Harrigan's department store, known for its elaborate window displays, when Daniel saw her. A woman sat in a wheelchair just outside the store's entrance. She wore a deep red coat that looked expensive but well-worn, and her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She was probably in her late 30s, Daniel guessed, with delicate features and an air of quiet dignity despite her circumstances. What caught his attention, though, was her hands. She was moving them in deliberate patterns, signing to the passers-by. Her expression was hopeful but tired, as though she'd been there for some time without success. Daniel had taken a sign language class years ago. Back in college, though, he'd forgotten most of it. But he recognized the basic gestures. She was asking for help. Most people walked past without acknowledging her. A few glanced over but quickly looked away, uncomfortable or uncertain. Daniel understood that impulse the modern world had made. People wary of street encounters, unsure of what was real need and what was something else. But there was something about this woman that made him pause. Perhaps it was the quality of her coat, which suggested this situation was recent rather than chronic. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with a kind of dignity that spoke of pride being overcome by necessity. Or perhaps it was simply that he'd learned, through his own grief and struggle, that life could reduce any of us to unexpected circumstances. He slowed his pace, and his daughters, sensing the change, looked up at him questioningly. The woman's hands moved again, and Daniel caught fragments of meaning. "Please," she signed, "help." Lucy had noticed her too. "Daddy, what's that lady doing with her hands?" "She's using sign language, sweetheart. It's how people who can't hear or speak communicate." Emma moved closer to her father's side. "Why can't she hear?" "Some people are born that way, honey. Some people become that way from illness or injury. But it doesn't make them less than anyone else. They just experience the world differently." The woman had seen them watching. Her hands moved again, more deliberately this time, and she made eye contact with Daniel. There was something in her expression, not desperation exactly, but a kind of quiet plea that spoke of circumstances beyond her control. Daniel felt his daughter's eyes on him, knew they were watching to see what he would do. This was one of those moments, he realized, where children learn by example rather than explanation. What he did next would teach them more about compassion and human dignity than any lecture ever could. He approached slowly so as not to startle her, and knelt down to be at her eye level. His daughters gathered behind him, curious and a little uncertain. The woman's expression shifted to surprise, then cautious hope. Her hands moved in a question, and though Daniel couldn't fully understand it, he got the general meaning. He held up his hands apologetically and spoke slowly, making sure she could read his lips. "I'm sorry. I only know a little sign language." "Not enough." She nodded, understanding, and reached into a bag beside her wheelchair. She pulled out a small notebook and pencil, her movements graceful despite what must have been cold, numbed fingers. She wrote something and turned it toward him. "My name is Catherine. Read. I lost my hearing and use of my leg 6 months ago in a car accident. My insurance ran out. I'm trying to get money for medication and therapy. I'm not asking for much, just whatever you can spare. God bless you for stopping." Daniel read the note carefully, aware of his daughters reading over his shoulder. He looked back at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw beyond the immediate circumstances to the person beneath. He saw someone who'd probably had a very different life 6 months ago. Someone who was fighting to maintain dignity while asking strangers for help. Someone who reminded him, uncomfortably, that fate could turn on anyone at any moment. Sophie's small voice spoke up behind him. "Daddy, she's sad. Can we help her?" Daniel reached for his wallet, but even as he did, he knew that money alone wasn't really what was needed here. Money might help for a day, maybe a week, but it wouldn't address the real problem. This woman needed more than a handout. She needed someone to see her as a person, not a problem. An idea formed in his mind. It was probably impractical. It would certainly complicate his already complicated life. But sometimes the right thing to do was also the difficult thing to do. He took out a $20 bill and handed it to Catherine, but then he took her notebook and pencil and wrote his own message. "I'd like to help you properly. Would you come have coffee with me and my daughters? Let's talk about what you really need. No strings attached. I promise we're safe. My daughters will vouch for me." He turned the notebook to show her, watching her face as she read. He saw surprise, then suspicion, then a flicker of something that might have been hope tempered by experience. She looked at his daughters, who stood watching with wide, curious eyes. Lucy smiled encouragingly. Emma waved. Sophie simply stared with the unself-conscious directness of very young children. Catherine's hands moved, a question. Daniel shook his head. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." She wrote again. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know me." Daniel took the pencil. "Because 6 months ago you probably had a regular life. Because it could just as easily be me sitting there. Because my daughters are watching, and I want them to learn that we help people when we can. Because it's almost Christmas and nobody should be alone on the street." He paused, then added one more line. "Because my wife died 3 years ago, and I remember what it felt like when people helped us when we needed it most." Catherine read his words and her eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, then wrote, "Coffee would be nice. Thank you." There was a cafe just down the street, a place called Murphy's that Daniel and the girls frequented. It had big windows, comfortable booths, and a patient staff who didn't mind when Sophie spilled her hot chocolate or Emma talked too loudly. Daniel positioned himself behind Catherine's wheelchair, and she showed him how to release the brake and navigate properly. The girls walked alongside, chattering among themselves about this unexpected turn in their evening. Inside Murphy's, they took a large corner booth. Daniel helped Catherine transfer from her wheelchair to the bench seat, surprised at how natural it felt to provide assistance once she'd shown him how. The girls slid in on the opposite side, arranging themselves with Lucy in the middle, naturally taking on her role as the responsible older sister. The waitress Linda, who'd served them many times before, approached with menus and her usual friendly smile. If she was surprised by their unusual party, she didn't show it. Years of waitressing had probably taught her not to make assumptions about people. They ordered coffee for the adults, hot chocolate for the girls, and a selection of pastries to share. Catherine tried to protest the food, but Daniel waved her off. "You can't have coffee without something sweet. House rules." Once the orders were placed and Linda had moved away, Catherine pulled out her notebook again and began to write. Daniel watched her form the letters carefully, her handwriting elegant despite the awkward angle and the cold that must have made her hands stiff. "I don't know what to say except thank you. Most people won't even look at me. I've been out there for 3 hours today, and you're the first person to stop." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same one he felt whenever he encountered unnecessary human suffering. "Tell me what happened. If you're comfortable sharing, Catherine wrote for several minutes, occasionally pausing to sip the coffee Linda brought. Her story emerged in fragments, each sentence a small piece of a larger tragedy. She'd been a high school music teacher, specializing in choir and vocal performance. She'd loved her job, loved working with teenagers, loved the moment when a shy student discovered they could actually sing. She'd been engaged to a wonderful man named Peter, planning a summer wedding. Then came the accident. A drunk driver running a red light. Peter had been killed instantly. Catherine had spent 2 months in the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries. When she finally woke up fully, she discovered she'd lost her hearing, damage from the head trauma, and that the injuries to her spine meant she might never walk again. Her insurance had covered the initial hospitalization,